All right, in learning target 9 and 10, we're going to be dealing with the quadratic formula, solving quadratics, but there's a few bell work warm-up problems here that we need to address. I couldn't even remember why I put number 1 on here until I did the notes myself. Why would I be looking at slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b, in a quadratic unit? Well, let's see. What would you do to put that in slope-intercept form? Anybody? Oh, it's frozen. Let me unfreeze it for you so you guys can. Video's not frozen. There we go. You got it. Add 4x, both sides. So 2y equals 4x plus 10. Then you divide both sides by 2. And this is why it's in the notes, this step right here. How do you do that? You divide them both by 2, right? You divide them both by 2. In the quadratic formula, you're going to have a lot of 2 things in the top and dividing by 1 thing in the bottom. You got to divide them both by 2. So you end up with 2x plus 5. All right, now in the quadratic formula, there's a square root in every problem. And the part that gives most people trouble is reducing that square root. And the second part that gives trouble is reducing the fraction that follows. All right, so square root of 28. It's not a perfect square. When you type it in the calculator, you get a decimal. But there is a perfect square that goes into 28. 4 and 7, you got it. 4 times 7. So you can break this apart as square root of 4 times square root of 7. And the square root of 4 turns into 2. 2 square roots of 7. You're definitely going to want number 2, 3, and 4 on your notes because we're going to use them in the notes. Square root of 0. Sometimes you just have to take the calculator and type it in. Square root of 0, it's 0. The thing that you would multiply by itself to get 0 is 0. So the square root of 0 turns into 0. Number 4, this is algebra 2 concept. There's a negative under the square root. So you can use square root of negative 1 times 4. And you're right, I heard it already. Square root of negative 1 times square root of 4. That square root of negative 1 is the I part, the imaginary part. So this is I, and square root of 4 is 2, so 2I. If that's kind of confusing, that's learning target 6 and 7 notes. And the last one, square root of 80. What numbers are you thinking that you could use to reduce that? Usually there's 30 people in here, and I usually get both options. 4 and 20, 4 and 20, or 16 and 5. Usually those 2 numbers get shouted out. In fact, they did last period. But which one do we use? You use the bigger perfect square. Use the 16 times 5. It's kind of like reducing a fraction. If you don't find the biggest factor that will reduce, you're going to have to reduce the fraction again and again and again, right? Same thing with square root. There's actually, you can't see it in the video, but on the board behind me here, there's an example of one that's going to show up in your homework. So if you're working on that, square root of 180, here's the 2 options that you have. You'll get the same answer, but it's much longer if you don't find the biggest perfect square first. We'll talk about it later. All right, so this reduces to square root of 16 times square root of 5, which is 4 square roots of 5. And now for the notes. You don't have this slide, but the quadratic formula is learning target 9. The discriminant is learning target 10. They are very much connected. The discriminant is part of the quadratic formula. All right, now, quadratic formula is a formula that can be used to find exact roots, exact solutions, as long as you have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So like learning target 5. It has to equal 0 before you can use the formula. And then the quadratic formula is right here. It's in your book. It's on your notes. It's also on the yellow sheet. So you don't have to necessarily memorize it, although I would highly recommend it. Opposite of b, I'll read it out loud. It's the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that divided by 2a. All right, now let's use it. 3 examples. The form you need is right here. The formula that you need is right here. So we need it to be in this form, and then we'll use this formula. Number 1, it's in the right form. A is 1, B is -8, and C is 9. Once you've identified A, B, and C, it's plug and chug. Put them in the formula and see what happens. But I would recommend you follow this first one with me because I do it kind of weird, all right? X equals opposite of B, positive 8, the opposite of a negative 8, plus or minus an empty square root. This is what I like to do. You don't have to, but I like to leave an empty square root right there. And in the bottom of the fraction, it's 2 times A, so 2 times 1. Now you'll notice at the bottom of your notes there's a template that says blank squared minus 4 times blank. That represents B squared minus 4 times A times C. It represents the thing that goes under the square root. Highly recommend you do that down here at the bottom. Find the number at the bottom because it's learning target 10. Go ahead and ruin the surprise. It's going to be what we talk about on the back of the notes. Okay? So what number do you get when you put 1, negative 8, and 9 in? 1 goes here, negative 8 goes here, and 9 goes there. What number do you get? And use your calculator to find it and see what you get. Because I see people type it in 2 different ways. You get 2 different numbers. Is actually right. Yeah, the 28. Be careful. If you don't put parentheses around your negative 8, when you square it, the calculator is going to take the opposite of 8 squared. All right, so 28 is the number for B squared minus 4AC. So 28 is the number that goes up here under the square root. It's over. The rest of this is algebra 1, simplifying square roots and simplifying fractions. First, or next step, 8 plus or minus, the denominator is 2. Go back to the bell work. The square root of 28 was 2 square roots of 7. So we'll replace the 28 with 2 square roots of 7. So 2 square roots of 7. And then you have 2 things in the top of the fraction, both being divided by 2. So they both get divided by 2. So the 8 over 2 becomes 4. And 2 square roots of 7, 2 square roots of 7 divided by 2 is kind of like 2x divided by 2. When you divide 2x by 2, you get x, right? When you divide 2 square roots of 7 by 2, you get square root of 7. Okay? Very similar. So you get square root of 7. And now there's 2 answers. X equals 4 plus the square root of 7, and x equals 4 minus the square root of 7. Those are exact. You missed yesterday. We talked it. You know, the second calc 0, left bound, right bound, decimal answers, they are not. So when you're asked to find exact answers, they're going to have square roots in them if they're decimals. Like that, the whole decimal that never stops. So 4 plus square root of 7, 4 minus square root of 7 are exact. You'll need to see a little more in detail about exact. All right, next one. I'm going to. Let's put an example before we. You can't use the formula unless it equals 0. So in number 2, what are you going to do? Yeah, add that 16 to the left side. So you get x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 0, and use a 1 for your. And then in example 3, I like to keep the a positive. I would recommend it's easier to reduce your fractions later. So if that x squared is already positive, I'm going to subtract the x to the left side and add the 9 to the right side, which will leave 0 on the right. On the side, we'll get x squared, negative 5x minus x. Again, I'll pause the video. All right, so we paused it, took a little bit of time to try them. But on the board here, that's the template that I would recommend you use every time. Put the plus or minus, the empty square root, etc. And the opposite of b here would be negative 8. The a goes there, it's 1. And then we'll go to the bottom of the notes to find what goes under the square root. and they're already plugged in, A, B, and C. 64 minus 64, you get 0. Or type it in the calculator, you should get 0. And while we're here, let's go ahead and find the other number. The other number that's going to go under the square root in the next problem. 36 minus 40, you end up with -4. So at the top, this one should say 0, and this one should say -4. And we'll go ahead and do the opposite of B in example 3 as well. The opposite of a -6 would be +6, and A is 1. So that's the algebra 2 part. Pretty easy. Just plug and chug. Put the numbers in. The algebra 1 part, reducing the square roots and reducing the fractions. Let's see how that goes. Number 2. Opposite of 8, plus or minus the square root of 0 from the bell work was 0, and divided by 2. So for the sake of homework's going to kind of do, your homework, sometimes that 0 that's under the square root is going to be a 25. And what's the square root of 25 going to say? It's going to say 5. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and break this apart into 2 answers. -8 plus 0 divided by 2, because that 0 could be a 5. And -8 minus 0 divided by 2, because again, that 0 could be a 5. The 2 answers are -8 plus nothing is -8 divided by 2, -4, and -8 minus 0, still -8 divided by 2. You get -4 for both. 0 had been a 5, you actually get 2 different. All right, so you only got one answer in that problem. One answer, -4. Number 3, example 3, let's finish it. 6 plus or minus, if we look back at spell work, the square root of -4. Square root of -4 was 2i. -4 was 2i. So we'll use that here. 6 plus or minus 2i divided by 2. Two things being divided by 2. So divided by 2 turns into 3. The 2 divided by 2 turns into I. And your answers are 3 plus I and 3 minus I. All right, just laying a little foundation for later. Laying a little foundation for later. What's special about those 2 answers? What are they called? All right, so that's not for today. That's for later. All right, now let's finish the notes. This is where even if you're in lab, eyes up here. All right, so let's talk about it. You see the number at the bottom here? 28, 0, -4. It's the number of the square root, right? What's going to have to be true under the square root for you to get those I answers? What kind of numbers are going to have? It makes sense. Otherwise, you're not going to get an I, right? All right, what about this? What kind of answer, what kind of number would have to be under the square root to get only one answer? A 0, right? So let's start with those 2. The thing under the square root, that b squared minus 4ac, it's got a name. It's called the discriminant. So on the back of your notes, you don't have part of this because I added it this morning, but the b squared minus 4ac, the number that goes under the square root, not the square root, but the number that goes under it, called the discriminant. All right, now let's skip the whole definition and go to the box that you have. Go to the bottom. The b squared minus 4ac, the discriminant. If it's smaller than 0, it's a negative. And if the discriminant is negative, you just said it made sense for you to get I answers, right? And how many of them? 2. You'll get it conjugates, right? So you get 2 complex roots, 2 complex solutions if the thing under the square root, the discriminant, is negative. Right above it, if the discriminant is 0, what kind of answer are you going to get? You're only going to get one answer, one real. All right, then let's talk about the last 2 situations when the discriminant is positive. There's 2 situations. All right, so back here, we saw one of them, 28. The first example, when the discriminant was 28, square root answers, right? Those are called irrational. Irrational. Now let's imagine just for a second. What if that 28 weren't? What if 25? What happened different in this problem? What would be different about this problem? 2 squared roots of 7 wouldn't say that. If it were a 25 under the square root, what would that 2 squared roots of 7 say? 5. So it would be 8 plus 5 divided by 2 and 8 minus 5 divided by 2. You get fractions. Or you get a number, right? It's called rational. So the last two cases, the last two situations, if the discriminant's bigger than 0 and it's a perfect square, you get 2 rational roots. Last, if it's not a perfect square, the square root's not going to go away, and you're going to get 2 irrational. So I'm going to highlight these, okay? These are the things, these are the words that you'll need to write when it asks this question. State. I'm going to get first on the discriminant. Second part's going to say literally those words. So this table, highly recommend, not as big as it is. It's too big, but put it on your note card. Find a place, put it on your note card. All right, that's the end of the video part. Learning target 9 and